7 hangars at the Saky Air Base are burning, and inside at least 7 of them sat Russian fighter jets, Su-30S, Su-30SM-S, a couple of Su-24 bombers, the same aircraft that have been throwing guided bombs across southern Ukraine for years. Ukraine's security service says its drones reached all of them in a single night. And here is the detail that turns a raid into something colder and more deliberate. It was the second time in 1 week they had done it to the exact same base. Not a lucky hit, not a one-off sabotage run. A base being visited on a schedule, like a debt collector who already has a key. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A country under invasion, fighting on the ground across a 1,000-kilometer front, is now able to fly cheap drones deep into occupied Crimea, twice in 5 days, and put fires inside the hangars where Russia parks aircraft worth $30 to $50 million each. The peninsula that Moscow annexed in 2014 and turned into a fortress, the place that was supposed to be the safe rear, the launch pad, the untouchable base of operations for the whole southern campaign, is being treated like a target range. And the men who own it can no longer promise it's safe. It's the first week of July 2026, and I want to walk you through exactly how this happened, because the story the numbers tell is very different from the one you'll hear shouted in headlines. This is Professor Alex. If you want the version that checks the claims before it repeats them, take a second and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Now let me take you back to the 2 nights that matter. The first strike came overnight into the 1st of July. Ukraine's security service, the SBU, said its drones scored 5 confirmed hits on aircraft hangars at Saky, which sits on the western coast of Crimea and also goes by the name Novofedorivka. According to their own account, 2 of those hangars had Su-30 and Su-30SM fighters sitting inside them at the time. Afterward, a fire took hold in the hangar where the Su-30SM was parked, which the service pointed to as evidence the strike landed where it was meant to. And they put a price tag on it, openly, almost clinically, $30 to $50 million per aircraft, depending on how it's configured. 2 days later, they came back. On the 3rd of July, the SBU said drones hit 7 hangars at Saky, and this time the tally was larger, at least 7 aircraft destroyed or damaged, a mix of Su-30SMs, Su-30S, and Su-24 frontline bombers. The same night, they also struck the Hvardiiske Air Base further inland, where 2 hangars were being used to store Shahed attack drones and aviation equipment. So in the span of a week, one security service put fires inside 2 of the main aviation hubs Russia relies on to hold Crimea. The head of that service, Major General Yevgeny Kamara, framed it plainly. Every operation means fewer enemy aircraft, fewer logistics assets, fewer warehouses. Attrition, stated out loud, as policy. Now here's where I have to slow you down, because this is exactly the point where a lot of coverage stops being careful. Those figures, 7 hangars, 7 aircraft, come from Ukraine's own security service. Russia has said nothing publicly about the strike, and when independent analysts looked at NASA's fire detection satellite data over Saky, they saw a thermal anomaly in the area after the reported attack, but not sitting directly on the aircraft parking or the hangar line. That doesn't mean nothing happened. Fires get put out, satellites pass over on their own timing, and damage in occupied territory is genuinely hard to confirm from the outside. But it does mean the honest version of this story has a gap in it, and anyone who tells you 7 jets are definitely scrap metal is filling that gap with confidence they haven't earned. I'd rather hand you the gap and let you sit with it. So why hangars? Why is Ukraine so focused on those specific buildings, and why does it keep working? Here's the uncomfortable answer from Moscow. Unlike a lot of modern air forces that tuck their aircraft into hardened shelters, thick concrete built to shrug off a hit, Russia has historically parked its planes out in the open, or under light hangars that were never designed to stop a drone. For years, that was a reasonable bet, because the planes were deep inside territory nobody could reach. The strategy wasn't armor, the strategy was distance, and Ukraine's drone program has quietly erased the distance. After Ukraine's raid on Russia's strategic bomber bases in June of last year, the one that reached airfields thousands of kilometers from the front, Russian forces did start pouring concrete for real shelters at some bases. But you don't re-shelter an entire air force in a year. There are still soft targets sitting on soft aprons, and Saky has been one of them, hit again and again since 2022. That's the tactical picture. But the tactical picture isn't the real story, and if you only watch the fireworks, you'll miss what Kyiv is actually doing. Because these 2 nights weren't improvised. They were the closing move of something Ukraine announced in advance and gave a deadline to. Back in late June, President Zelensky posted that he'd approved a 40-day operation by the SBU, an influence operation, in his words, meant to pressure Russia toward ending the war. He'd just met with Kamara, who reported on what Kyiv has started calling its long-range sanctions and medium-range sanctions. Sit with that phrase for a second because it's doing a lot of work. Sanctions are an economic weapon. By calling drone strikes sanctions, Ukraine is telling you how it thinks about these targets, not as battlefield kills, but as a way to raise the cost of the war until the numbers stop working for the Kremlin. A refinery that stops refining, a hangar that stops sheltering, a rail line that stops carrying. Each one is a line item Moscow now has to pay to defend or pay to lose. And a 40-day clock matters more than it sounds. It turns a scatter of raids into a campaign with a shape. Independent analysts who've watched this framing pointed out that the real aim looks cumulative. Ukraine isn't just trying to blow up individual planes, it's trying to force Russia to react, over and over, day after day. Move the air defenses here, repair the runway there, explain the smoke over Crimea to your own public, guard the rear while you're still trying to push at the front. It's a way of making a larger country spend its attention, which is the one resource even a larger country runs out of. Which brings me, finally, to the piece the title promised you, the sense that Ukraine waited for the right moment before it hit. Let me tell you what that waiting actually was, because it's more interesting than the movie version. In the weeks before these strikes, Ukraine's military intelligence reported that its long-range campaign had forced Russia to redeploy air defense systems, pulling them back to protect the 2 places Moscow decided it could not lose, the capital itself and the Kerch Bridge, the road and rail link that ties Crimea to the Russian mainland. Zelensky said it almost bluntly. Those are the 2 areas Russia was ordered to defend, at the expense of weakening coverage everywhere else, including occupied Crimea. Read that again. To save Moscow and the bridge, Russia thinned the umbrella over the peninsula. And that's the waiting. Ukraine didn't sit around hoping for planes to land. It spent months making Russia move its shield, and then it struck the aircraft that were sitting under a thinner one. That is a genuinely different kind of warfare than the one Russia planned for. Moscow's whole posture rested on depth, on the idea that scale and geography would keep the important things out of reach. A drone that costs a fraction of a fighter jet has narrowed that geography to almost nothing, and you can watch the strain show up in Russia's own numbers. When Kyiv announced the 40-day operation, Moscow's mayor said air defenses shot down dozens of drones heading for the capital in the space of about an hour. Russia has been reporting hundreds of drones intercepted across its regions on the heavier nights. Even if you take those interception claims at face value, and you should, in the sense that they're probably real, think about what they cost. Every interceptor missile fired at a cheap drone is a missile that isn't defending something else, spent at a price ratio that runs the wrong way for the defender. That's the quiet math underneath all of this. Ukraine keeps sending things that are cheap to make and expensive to stop, and the strikes haven't stopped at Saky. On the 4th of July, Ukraine's military intelligence released details of a drone strike on the Belbek airfield in Crimea from back in late June. A day later, on the 5th, Ukraine's general staff reported fresh strikes on the Hvardiiske airfield again, along with 2 road bridges in the Donetsk region and 3 ammunition depots spread across Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kherson. Look at that target list as a set, not as separate events. Airfields, bridges, ammunition. That's not a grudge campaign against Russian planes. That's a methodical attempt to take apart the machinery that lets Russia fight in the south. The aircraft that strike, the roads that resupply, the depots that feed the guns. And Crimea sits at the center of it, because Crimea is the hinge. You can see the pressure landing on the occupation itself. When the 40-day operation was announced, the Russian-installed authorities in Crimea declared a regional state of emergency. That came just after Ukrainian forces hit a railway bridge across the North Crimean Canal, along with fuel facilities and other military infrastructure on the peninsula. A state of emergency is an administrative act, but it's also a confession. It's the occupying government admitting, in writing, that daily life on its prized possession is being disrupted badly enough to require it. For a piece of territory Moscow spent a decade selling as permanently, irreversibly Russian, That's a crack in the story. So let's talk about the thing this actually costs, in money, because that's where the war is really being fought now. A Su-30SM is a twin-engine, twin-seat, multi-role fighter, a serious aircraft, and not one Russia can conjure quickly. Ukraine's own valuation put each of the jets it targeted at $30 to $50 million. Multiply that across even a portion of the aircraft claimed over these 2 nights, and you're talking about the price of an entire squadron, potentially, sitting in buildings that cost far less to hit than to replace. Meanwhile, the refinery strikes that have run alongside this campaign have been hammering the other side of Russia's ledger, the oil revenue that pays for the war in the first place. Back-to-back drone strikes on Moscow's own oil refinery reportedly shut it down and worsened a fuel crunch, bringing the discomfort home to a population that had spent 4 years watching the war from a comfortable distance. When the fuel gets expensive in Moscow, the war stops being an abstraction. That's the point. And I want to be fair here, because the finance instinct in me won't let a clean narrative go unchecked. Does any of this actually push Russia toward ending the war? That's the promise wrapped inside the phrase influence operation, and it's the promise most likely to disappoint. Putin has shown no public sign of accepting terms that Ukraine could live with. Russian forces are still striking Ukrainian cities, a ballistic missile at Kyiv the same week the operation was announced. Lavrov has said Russia will keep hitting back. So if you're measuring this campaign by whether it drags Moscow to a table in 40 days, you're probably going to call it a failure, and you won't be wrong on that narrow question. The honest read is that these strikes are less a diplomatic trigger and more a slow act of attrition, a way of making the war heavier to carry, month after month, without any guarantee about when the weight finally matters. Nobody running this operation actually knows the answer to that. Neither do I. And anyone who tells you they do is selling you a feeling, not an analysis. There's a diplomatic backdrop worth holding in view, too. Zelensky has said he came away from a recent G7 summit with further promises of foreign support, including from President Trump, and that the aid would help Ukraine step up the effort to force Putin toward talks. A NATO summit is on the calendar as another possible moment for hardening that support. Even prisoner exchanges have continued through all of this, 160 from each side sent home in the same stretch of days as the drone barrage. That mix tells you something true about this war that neither side likes to say out loud. It's escalating and grinding at the same time. Fires in Crimean hangars one night, prisoners walking home the next. Both things real, both things happening in the same week. Here's what I keep coming back to, the piece I can't quite let go of. The center of gravity in this war has moved, and it moved without a single dramatic announcement. It moved into a set of workshops turning out drones that cost less than a used car, guided by people who have learned to read where the shield is thin. Russia built its entire theory of security around being too big and too deep to reach. Crimea was the proof of that theory, annexed, fortified, garrisoned, declared permanent. And now the proof is the problem. The bases are known. The hangars are soft. The air defenses have been pulled toward Moscow and the bridge, and everyone can see the gap that leaves behind. You don't need to believe every casualty figure or every claim of 7 jets destroyed to see the larger shape of it. The shape is a fortress that no longer feels like one to the people inside it. And that's the part Moscow can't easily fix with a statement or a denial. You can stay silent about a strike, the way Russia stayed silent about Saky. You can dispute the damage. But you can't undeclare a state of emergency in front of your own occupied population, and you can't unmove the air defenses you already pulled back to guard the capital, and you can't make the geography big again once cheap machines have made it small. The Kremlin's answer so far has been concrete, new shelters at the bases that got hit. But concrete is slow, and drones are fast, and the arithmetic of that race has not been running in Russia's favor. So I'll leave you with the question I genuinely can't answer, the one worth carrying out of here. If a war can be made steadily more expensive, night after night, refinery after hangar after bridge, and the country paying that bill still refuses to stop, then what exactly is the cost that finally changes a mind? Ukraine is betting there is one. Russia is betting there isn't. And right now, in the smoke over a Crimean airfield, neither of them knows who's right. This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.